Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino didn't raise his voice, didn't theatrically pound the table, didn't need a single cheap trick. He just put one number in the air, $4.2 million, and let it hover where everyone could feel the weight of it. He looked straight at Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and asked, in plain English, how a member of Congress on a $174,000 salary ends up tied to a cash purchase in Wesley Heights. No speech about class struggle, no viral clapback, no Instagram story was going to change the fact that the math felt hostile. And in that sealed ethics committee room on November 3, 2025, the silence had a sound all its own. AOC sat at the witness table in a burgundy blazer and black top, gold hoops catching the light the way they always do in photos. She had the signature red lipstick, the practiced posture, the familiar look that says, "I belong in this room, and I know the camera loves me." 3 attorneys in tailored suits flanked her, the kind of lawyers who don't do discount and don't accept exposure as payment. Across from her, Bongino had binders with official-looking markings and the calm focus of a guy who has spent years staring down financial puzzles. Next to him, Special Agent Jennifer Martinez sat with a laptop open, ready to pull up anything that needed to be seen, and nothing in her face suggested she was there for a photo op. If you're wondering how a hearing that AOC's team allegedly treated like just another round of political harassment suddenly turned into a pressure cooker, you're not alone. In her world, a vague subpoena usually means one thing: a chance to turn outrage into fundraising and turn scrutiny into martyrdom. She'd survived plenty of loud controversies, the kind that trend for 2 days and then evaporate the moment something shinier hits the feed. The Met Gala. Tax the Rich dress had been litigated 1,000 times in 1,000 comment sections, and it had already matured into a talking point like a well-aged wine, expensive but familiar. So when she walked in, expecting another predictable clash, what she met instead was something colder, a storyline anchored in documents, not vibes. Bongino started where any prosecutor-type mind would start, because it's where every normal person starts too, the house. He described a property on Woodley Road, Noticeably in Wesley Heights, with the kind of square footage that doesn't come with a starter home excuse. He painted it in details: kitchen finishes, wine storage, a pool, details that aren't illegal, but aren't exactly Bronx apartment energy either. Then he slid the purchase structure into view. An LLC, Bronx Future Holdings, registered out of Delaware, listing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Riley Roberts as managing members. None of that proves wrongdoing by itself, but it sets the table for the question that makes people lean forward. Why Delaware? Why an LLC? And why cash? The cash part is the grenade, because cash is the one thing you can't talk your way into. A mortgage is a monthly story. Cash is a moment of truth. Bongino put the salary arithmetic on the record in that slow, deliberate way that feels insulting only because it's so simple. Even if you pretend taxes don't exist, even if you pretend rent doesn't exist, even if you pretend groceries and student loans are a myth invented by cynical boomers, the numbers still don't naturally climb to $4.2 million. So he asked again, where did the missing millions come from? And the room reportedly stayed quiet long enough for everyone to hear their own thoughts, arguing with each other. That's when he moved from questions to exhibits, and the whole atmosphere shifted. Bank statements for the LLC were passed around like contraband, and you could almost hear the paper edges scratching the polished table. 3 wire transfers appeared in a tight cluster of dates, a neat little trio that looked, at minimum, like a coincidence begging for an explanation. One transfer for $1.2 million, another for 1.5 million, then another for $1,000,000, and then 5 million, all landing within days of each other and totaling the exact purchase price people had been whispering about. If you've ever watched someone realize the conversation is no longer PR, but accounting, you know the look that can spread across a face before a single word is spoken. The senders, as presented, were LLCs, with names that sound like they were generated by a political branding intern at 2 a.m. Progressive Future Fund, Grassroots Action Network, Democratic Advancement Coalition. Names that promise moral purpose without explaining operational reality. Bongino described them as Delaware-registered entities with thin public footprints, and he framed the central issue as transparency. Who are they? Who funds them? And why do they exist? Delaware, as everyone in politics knows, can be a perfectly legal home for a company, and it can also be a convenient curtain for the curious. So he didn't say crime, he didn't shout corruption. He simply posed the kind of question that sticks. Why do movement entities need to behave like shadows? Then came the bigger map, the kind that makes staffers in the back straighten up. A flowchart appeared on the screen showing money moving through organizations with colored lines that suggested planning, not spontaneity. Bongino's presentation in this telling pointed toward a donor coordination ecosystem and referenced the Democracy Alliance as a hub. He also referenced open society foundations and billionaire-linked networks in a way that was careful on its face. More connected to than directly ordered by, more linked than signed personally. And the rhetorical punch wasn't, here's what happened, but if this is what it looks like, why does it look like this? AOC, according to the scene as you've framed it, tried to pivot into familiar territory. Privacy, harassment, identity, power. And in a different kind of hearing, that might have been enough to muddy the water for a news cycle. But documents don't blush, and spreadsheets don't apologize, and a wire confirmation doesn't care how many followers you have. Bongino reportedly cut through the rhetoric with one line that felt less like politics and more like common sense. Public trust becomes relevant when private wealth moves in ways the public can't plausibly understand. It wasn't an accusation so much as a premise, and it left her needing something other than a slogan. What made the room uneasy, in your narrative, wasn't simply the money, but the contrast. AOC is famous, rightly or wrongly, for building a brand that frames the wealthy elite as the central villain in America's story. She's made entire speeches about dark money, about donor influence, about how billionaires warp the system like heat on asphalt. So when the evidence board points to billionaire-adjacent structures, the question becomes existential. Is she the person exposing the machine, or is she a highly effective product of it? And once you ask that out loud, you can't unask it, even if the answer is no. Bongino then widened the lens to Riley Roberts, because politics always gets weird when the money starts orbiting partners and relatives. A company called Digital Outreach Strategies was brought into the narrative, described as a consulting shop tied to political committees aligned with AOC's world. He didn't need to say fake to make the audience think it. He just leaned on what investigators always lean on: deliverables. What work was produced? What documents exist? What campaigns can be traced? What emails show strategy? What invoices match outcomes? If the answers are vague, the story becomes sharper, because vagueness is where suspicion lives rent-free. Martinez, in the scene, adds the kind of detail that makes lawyers stare at their notepads a little harder. Depositions, she says, interviews under oath, repeated questions, repeated fog. People describing strategic insights without showing the strategy, describing digital presence without offering a plan, describing consulting the way kids describe a dog they swear they have but can't ever bring to school. None of that is proof of a crime, but it's a flashing sign for the public. Why was so much paid for something so hard to describe? And when the figure lands, $1.6 million over several years, the amount doesn't merely raise eyebrows, it starts renting office space in the mind. The narrative point isn't gotcha, it's hypocrisy pressure. Because the public doesn't need to know every detail of compliance law to sense when something feels out of tune. If you campaign as a tribune of working people, then the standard isn't just legality, it's integrity, restraint, consistency. AOC's defenders could argue fairly that book deals and speaking fees can be lucrative and legal, and that celebrity culture doesn't automatically equal misconduct. But the question still sits there like a stubborn stain. When did the working-class story start dressing like a luxury catalog? And who paid for the wardrobe? From there, the story, as you laid it out, stacks categories like blocks, book money, bulk purchases, gifts, travel. Again, the careful way to tell it is not as verdict, but as contrast. If supportive organizations buy large quantities of your book, is that organic enthusiasm or a workaround that inflates royalties? If expensive fashion is loaned, is that a normal practice of celebrity culture or a benefit with a price tag that ethics rules would want disclosed? If campaign accounts cover travel that looks suspiciously like social climbing, what counts as official and what counts as personal in the age of influencer-politician hybrids? And if none of it is improper, then why does it all pile up into one big wait a second feeling that people can't shake? The Met Gala section in your script is the kind of thing that doesn't have to be criminal to be politically lethal. Because even people who don't know house gift thresholds know what a $35,000 ticket means in a country where families juggle rent like a second job. AOC wore tax the rich like a moral flair. But the room she wore it in is the kind of room where the rich throw parties for each other. That doesn't automatically make her wrong, but it does invite the kind of question that cuts through ideology. Is this protest, or is this branding, or is it both? And if it's both, who benefits more? Working families, or the person whose face becomes the headline? What really spikes tension in your version is the technique of pairing. Her public statements next to financial exhibits. A tweet saying politicians shouldn't take billionaire money beside a document showing money arriving from a billionaire-linked pipeline. A denunciation of dark money beside transfers from entities described as opaque and strategically structured. A speech about inequality beside imagery of a home purchase in a neighborhood associated with power and wealth. This kind of juxtaposition doesn't prove guilt, but it does create a narrative gravity that's hard to escape once it forms. At some point in your draft, the hearing's emotional core arrives. The moment the room stops being a place where people argue and becomes a place where people calculate. Chairman Michael Guest, as depicted, doesn't indulge theatrics. He pushes for direct answers. Democrats on the committee, even sympathetic ones, look uneasy because political protection has limits when the paper trail feels too specific. The lawyers begin to shift posture because you can feel the discussion edging toward what attorneys call exposure and what regular people call uh-oh. And then comes the fork in the road. Answer, explain, or refuse. Your text includes multiple declines to answer moments framed as Fifth Amendment territory. And that's the kind of thing that triggers public imagination instantly. Most voters don't parse legal strategy. They interpret silence as story. It's not fair. It's not always accurate. But it's real. The public hears, "I can't talk," and translates it into, "I don't want to." That's why politicians avoid it like stepping on a rake. Because even if counsel is being prudent, The optics are brutal. And in a drama built around authenticity, any silence reads like a crack in the mask, even if the person is innocent of the worst interpretations. From there, the narrative becomes a political avalanche more than a legal one. Leaks start because Washington runs on whispers the way cars run on gasoline. Headlines start to write themselves because a mansion, a progressive icon, and billionaire-linked money is the kind of trio that cable producers would tattoo onto their souls if they could. The story metastasizes across media ecosystems where nobody waits for court filings if a screenshot will do. And suddenly, the question isn't what happened. It's how many people were willing to believe whatever version best flatters their team. To keep it in the careful lane you asked for, the right way to frame the next part is as an if-then spiral, not a pronouncement. If investigators were to formally refer matters to DOJ, what would prosecutors focus on? Campaign conversion, disclosure omissions, tax inconsistencies, conflicts. If a grand jury were to hear this kind of story, what would matter most? Intent, documentation, patterns, witnesses? If you're a juror listening to accounts of consulting with no work product, what do you do with that? If you're a defense lawyer, what would you present to fill the gap? And if you're AOC, what do you even say that doesn't sound like either excuse or confession, especially when your public persona is built on moral clarity? You also wanted a small dose of humor and irony, the kind that doesn't punch down and doesn't get personal. So here's the gentlest version of the joke the internet is always ready to make. It's hard to sell "eat the rich" when you look like you've been snacking. Not because wealth is inherently evil, but because messaging is a contract, and voters are picky customers. If you sell authenticity as your premium product, then your receipts don't get to look like a luxury brand's annual report. And in politics, irony is never just irony. It's fuel for the other side, and sometimes for your own side too. The late-stage arc in your text races through indictment, trial, conviction, prison, expulsion, and sweeping political fallout. Because you asked explicitly not to convict anyone in the writing, the safer way to do that is to present it as a speculative cascade. What could happen if allegations like these were substantiated? What steps typically follow? What consequences are politically plausible? So the narrative can describe the sensation of the gears turning, referrals, filings, hearings, votes, without stating as fact that any particular charge was proven. It can also preserve the moral punch by focusing on the stakes: trust, image, money, and the gap between a brand and a balance sheet. That gap is where every political scandal lives, whether the person is found guilty of anything or not. The climax, then, isn't a verdict. It's a mirror. Because even the suggestion that a progressive celebrity politician could be entangled with opaque donor networks is the kind of thing that forces uncomfortable conversations. Is modern politics basically influencer culture with legislation attached? Are movements sometimes marketing campaigns with better typography? Do voters really want purity, or do they want performance, so long as the performance flatters their worldview? And when the performance collides with paperwork, who do they believe? The person on camera or the numbers on the page? In this kind of story, the most devastating line is never "you're guilty," because that's for courts, not narrators. The devastating line is "explain it," because explanations reveal priorities. If the explanation is coherent, the story cools. If it's messy, the story spreads. And if the explanation is "I'm being targeted," people ask the next question automatically. Targeted for what exactly, and why does the money map look the way it looks? That's why investigators, real or fictional, love spreadsheets. They don't argue back, and they don't get tired. Now, step back and look at the broader American picture you're trying to sell in voiceover form. We are living in an era where politics is brand management, and brand management is an industry built to make contradictions feel normal. A politician can rail against wealth while attending wealth's parties, and half the country will call it strategy, while the other half calls it fraud. A politician can claim to hate dark money while benefiting from structures that look dark, and supporters will say, "See, everyone does it," until it's their opponent, and then it's suddenly treason. So what makes your narrative sticky is that it doesn't ask viewers to pick a party. It asks them to notice the pattern. The pattern is simple. The louder someone talks about virtue, the more people want to inspect the ledger. Not because virtue is bad, but because virtue is a claim, and claims invite verification. AOC's entire rise is tied to a story of economic struggle and moral urgency, and that story has real power for people who feel ignored. But power attracts money, and money attracts operatives, and operatives attract shortcuts, and shortcuts attract investigators. And eventually, the whole thing attracts a room full of people asking uncomfortable questions. That's not a right-wing idea or a left-wing idea. It's just how gravity works in Washington. If you're going to keep the tone sharp without crossing the line into direct accusation, you lean on conditional language and you let the contradictions do the work. You say, if the transfers happened as described, what were they for? And why do they match the purchase price down to the dollar? You say, if an LLC exists primarily to hold a personal residence, why label it with movement-flavored language? You say, if consulting payments are legitimate, where's the work product, and why can nobody describe it clearly under oath? You say, if gifts were merely loans, why weren't they disclosed in a way that prevents questions like this from ever forming? And then you let the viewer's brain do what it always does. Connect dots, argue back, and keep watching. Anew. So the ending you want isn't, and then she went to prison, because that's a claim and you asked not to make claims as if they're settled fact. The ending you want is the warning label on modern political celebrity. If your identity is your shield, your finances will eventually become your cross-exam. If you build a career telling people the powerful are liars, don't act surprised when people decide you're powerful enough to inspect. If you monetize righteousness, you're going to get audited by the public's common sense even before any agency lifts a finger. And if your story is real, transparency makes you stronger. But if your story is curated, transparency is the one thing you can't afford. In the final frame, Bongino doesn't have to be a hero, and AOC doesn't have to be a villain for the audience to feel the tension. He just has to be the guy asking the question that refuses to die, and she just has to be the politician whose answers don't land. Because the moment voters suspect they've been sold a narrative instead of given the truth, they don't just get angry, they get entertained. And entertainment is how America processes betrayal now. Maybe nothing illegal happened, and it's all explainable with boring paperwork, legitimate income, lawful donations, and sloppy optics. But if that's the case, the simplest move is also the hardest move in politics. Show the receipts, cleanly, fully, and in a way that doesn't require a flowchart to understand. What happens next in stories like this is rarely about law and almost always about perception. Washington doesn't wait for conclusions. It waits for momentum, and momentum feeds on uncertainty. Once the idea takes hold that a narrative and a balance sheet might be telling different stories, the oxygen changes. Staffers start double-checking calendars, donors start rereading emails, and allies suddenly remember meetings they can't quite recall. Nothing explodes all at once, but everything starts leaning in the same direction. In the days after a closed-door hearing, like the one you described, the city doesn't buzz. It hums. Phones vibrate more than they ring. Texts replace calls, and phrases like "off the record" get used so often they lose meaning. Political reporters don't need confirmation to sense blood in the water. They just need one document and a whiff of hesitation. That's when background briefings multiply. Not because anyone wants to talk, but because nobody wants to be the last one silent. Silence, omitiuti, and in this town, is interpreted as strategy until it's interpreted as guilt, and the line between the two is thin. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the challenge isn't just defending a set of transactions, it's defending an identity. Her rise wasn't built on seniority or committee chairs, it was built on a feeling, a promise, a vibe that cut through the usual gray fog of Congress. She didn't just say the system was broken, she performed that belief in a way millions of people found electrifying. But when a politician's brand is authenticity, the tolerance for ambiguity shrinks dramatically. People will forgive ideology. They rarely forgive inconsistency dressed as virtue. The progressive ecosystem that helped elevate her understands this instinctively, which is why it reacts cautiously when questions like these surface. Nobody rushes to condemn, but nobody rushes to embrace either. Statements come out carefully worded, heavy on values, light on specifics, and rich in phrases like, "We await further clarity." That language isn't about facts. It's about time, buying it, stretching it, letting emotions cool or redirect. In politics, delay is often the most powerful form of defense. At the same time, conservative media doesn't need to wait. For them, the story writes itself, not as a legal case, but as a morality play. They frame the issue as hypocrisy incarnate, the embodiment of everything they've been accusing progressives of for years. Every mansion photo becomes symbolic, every designer outfit a punchline, every LLC filing a punch to the gut of the working-class narrative. Accuracy matters less than resonance, and this story resonates hard. But the more interesting tension isn't left versus right. It's believer versus skeptic. Many of AOC's supporters don't immediately flip. Instead, they enter a state of cognitive suspension. They ask themselves whether this is another smear, another hit job, another example of power trying to crush a disruptive voice. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It was built over years of real and exaggerated attacks alike. The problem is that bank records don't feel like tweets, and spreadsheets don't feel like slogans. This is where the questions start to matter more than the answers. Why do political movements increasingly rely on corporate-style structures that look indistinguishable from the systems they criticize? Why does grassroots often come packaged in legal wrappers that only high-end attorneys truly understand? Why does influence now flow through consulting contracts and nonprofit partnerships instead of smoke-filled rooms? And at what point does sophistication become camouflage? In modern American politics, money doesn't shout. It whispers, and it whispers through paperwork. LLCs, PACs, nonprofits, donor-advised funds, each one is legal in isolation, but together they form a maze that normal voters can't navigate. That complexity creates distance, and distance creates plausible deniability. It also creates suspicion, especially when the beneficiaries claim moral superiority over the very system enabling them. People don't hate money in politics because it exists. They hate it because it hides. The Riley-Roberts angle, as presented, lingers precisely because it feels familiar. Every scandal eventually has a cousin, a spouse, a friend, or a partner who just happens to be positioned at the money's edge. Sometimes it's innocent, sometimes it's a sloppy, and sometimes it's something else entirely. The public doesn't expect politicians to live monk-like lives, but it does expect boundaries that feel intuitive. When those boundaries blur, trust erodes faster than any indictment ever could. Defenders argue that proximity doesn't equal impropriety, and they're right in a narrow sense. Relationships aren't crimes, and success doesn't require poverty as proof of sincerity. But politics isn't judged in courtrooms first. It's judged in living rooms and comment threads. The average voter doesn't ask whether something is technically permissible. They ask whether it smells right. Once that smell changes, explanations have to work twice as hard. This is where humor sneaks in. The dark, ironic kind that American political commentary thrives on. People joke that "eat the rich" apparently pairs well with imported marble countertops. They share memes not because they're cruel, but because irony is how people process disappointment without fully admitting it. Laughter becomes a pressure valve, releasing frustration that used to fuel belief. And belief, once cracked, rarely reseals. As the narrative stretches, attention turns to institutions rather than individuals. If this situation raises eyebrows, what does it say about the broader progressive funding model? If donor networks coordinate strategies across candidates, where does independence actually begin and end? If movements rely on wealthy benefactors to survive, can they credibly claim to dismantle wealth concentration? These aren't accusations. They're philosophical landmines disguised as logistics. The Democratic Party, as an organization, hates this kind of moment. It doesn't fit neatly into electoral messaging, and it distracts from policy battles they'd rather be fighting. Leadership tends to default to neutrality, emphasizing due process while quietly preparing for every outcome. They've learned the hard way that premature loyalty can be as damaging as premature judgment. So they wait, watching polls, donor behavior, and media tone like traders watching a volatile market. Inside AOC's district, reactions are more complicated than headlines suggest. Some constituents rally instinctively, convinced that any scrutiny is proof she's threatening the right people. Others feel uneasy but conflicted, torn between admiration for her voice and discomfort with the optics. A smaller group, often quieter, wonders whether the story they believed was incomplete all along. Local politics has a way of grounding national drama in everyday expectations. The deeper question beneath all of this is whether American politics still allows for myth. For decades, voters accepted simplified stories because access to information was limited. Now, every filing is searchable, every photo is archived, and every inconsistency can be magnified endlessly. Myths don't die easily, but they do suffocate under documentation. The Internet doesn't forgive contradictions. It catalogs them. This is why the Bongino-style presentation lands even among people who don't like him. It isn't about ideology. It's about format. Binders, charts, timelines. These things signal seriousness in a culture exhausted by performative outrage. They suggest that someone has done the boring work, followed the threads, and asked unglamorous questions. Whether or not every implication holds, the effort itself changes the conversation. Critics argue that focusing on personal finances distracts from policy substance, and that argument has merit. Healthcare reform doesn't become less urgent because a politician owns a nice house. Climate change doesn't pause because consulting contracts look suspicious. But credibility is the currency that allows policy arguments to be heard. When credibility wobbles, even good ideas struggle to stand upright. Another uncomfortable truth is that AOC isn't unique in navigating these tensions. She's just more visible, more symbolic, and therefore more vulnerable to scrutiny. American politics is full of figures who campaign as populists while living elite lives. Most get away with it because they never promised otherwise. Her risk was making authenticity the centerpiece instead of a footnote. As speculation swirls, the legal process, if it moves at all, moves slowly. Investigations take months, sometimes years, and outcomes are rarely as cinematic as social media imagines. There are filings, motions, responses, clarifications, and settlements that never trend. The public, however, doesn't wait patiently. It fills gaps with narrative. And narrative, once formed, resists revision even when facts emerge. This is where restraint becomes critical for anyone telling the story. To say, "this proves," is to overreach and invite backlash. To say, "this raises questions," is to invite curiosity and sustained attention. The latter keeps audiences engaged without locking them into a conclusion. It also respects the line between commentary and accusation, a line that matters. If AOC addresses the situation head-on with transparency, the story could deflate. Clear explanations, detailed disclosures, and an acknowledgement of optics could recalibrate public perception. If she retreats into defiance and dismissal, the vacuum fills with speculation. Neither path guarantees redemption or ruin, but one at least engages reality. Politics rewards confrontation with facts more than confrontation with critics. For viewers listening to this as a long-form voiceover, the appeal isn't schadenfreude. It's the sense of watching a high-wire act wobble under the weight of its own symbolism. People aren't tuning in because they hate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Many tune in because they once believed in her. Disillusionment is more compelling than opposition because it carries emotional residue. That residue keeps people watching long after the credits should roll. Ultimately, this story isn't about whether one politician followed every rule to the letter. It's about whether modern political movements can survive the transparency they demand of others. It's about whether moral branding can coexist with financial complexity without collapsing under scrutiny. And it's about whether voters are willing to accept technically allowed when morally aligned was the promise. Those questions linger even if every investigation ends quietly. The real takeaway is that American politics is entering a phase where vibes are no longer enough. Charisma still matters, but documentation matters more. Social media can launch careers, but spreadsheets can end them. The age of the influencer politician collides inevitably with the age of radical transparency. Some will adapt, others will become cautionary tales. As this narrative continues to unfold, the tension remains unresolved by design. Nothing is settled, nothing is declared, and nothing is finished. There are only questions, contrasts, and the uneasy feeling that something doesn't quite line up. That feeling, more than any charge or verdict, is what reshapes political reputations. And once it takes hold, it doesn't let go easily.